Is it the first day of Christmas already? Because here is a cartridge for Atari. 3 of them, actually, on NES Works Gaiden.
I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh Lord.
A lot of people like to point to the Atari 2600 conversion of Namco's Pac-Man as the end of an era, the precipitation of the crash, the cause of a giant's downfall. So, it seems only fitting to mark the beginning of this new era of the Atari 2600 with a sequel to Pac-Man, Junior Pac-Man. I mean, none of that is actually true, because Pac-Man did not kill the 2600. It was a wretched release, sure, and no one who has ever played the coin-op machine likes it. Atari rushed it to market and cheaped out on materials, ensuring the programmer Todd Fry lacked either the time or the data space to create a proper conversion. But killing the 2600? No. There were plenty of egregiously bad arcade conversions during that era, and even as kids, my friends and I just kind of accepted ports like these as one of the limitations of home machines versus clearly powerful and expensive cabinets. Still, this does lead to one of the fun side stories from the Atari 2600 era, Atari's ongoing efforts to make good on the botched conversion of the original Pac-Man. First, we had Ms. Pac-Man, which turned out much better than that original tragic mess, thanks to a combination of lessons learned and a much larger ROM size. And now look, Junior Pac-Man isn't just better on 2600 than Pac-Man was, it might actually be better than Junior Pac-Man in arcades. For those who don't know the horrible, stupid saga of Pac-Man's arcade localizations and releases, you need to understand that this franchise operates according to the split timeline theory. On one hand, you have the prime timeline of releases created by Namco. From Pac-Man, you move along to Super Pac-Man, then Pac and Pal, and eventually end up at Pac-Land. None of these sequels had the magic of the first game, but they have the benefit of sharing something of a consistent creative vision and team, having been produced internally at Namco by Namco folks. In America, however, you also have the chaotic Midway timeline branch. Midway licensed Pac-Man from Namco, of course, and once that game became a mega hit, Midway decided that their license entitled them to do whatever the hell they wanted with the property, including the creation and release of all new material without Namco's sanction. This did result in the superlative Ms. Pac-Man from General Computer Corp., a game that most people agree surpasses the original Pac-Man. But you also have a great many lesser Pac derivatives. There was Baby Pac-Man, a pinball video game hybrid that was less than the sum of its parts thanks to the fact that it sucked both at being a Pac-Man arcade game running on the less powerful Galaxian board, and at being a pinball game. It's a terrible, boring table layout. There was Professor Pac-Man, a middling quiz game. There was new, exciting Pac-Man Plus, which wasn't really new or exciting. It just took the original game, remixed the maze layouts, and threw in some iffy new mechanics, and a Coke can for some reason. And finally, you had Junior Pac-Man. While not as dire as Baby Pac-Man or Pac-Man Plus, Junior Pac-Man still fell short of Ms. Pac-Man's golden greatness, despite also being crafted by GCC. The problem, I suspect, stems from the fact that GCC predicated Junior Pac-Man's design on a false premise. If Pac-Man is fun, they said, surely 3 times as much Pac-Man will be 3 times as fun. This is the same fallacy that led to retailers increasing their Atari 2600 stock orders by a factor of 10 once third parties arrived on the scene. Sometimes, less is more, and more is decidedly less. Junior Pac-Man features the little tyke conceived between Ms. Pac-Man's cutscenes. They meet, they kiss, suddenly they have a child on hand. This is that child's story. Junior resembles his parents, but slightly smaller and wearing a beanie cap. But he dwells in the same existential hell as his parents, damned forever to wander a maze, ever consuming, ever pursued by monsters that want him dead. It's a profoundly Catholic take on video game design. We don't know what Pac-Man's original sin was, precisely, but his son must tragically bear the weight of those crimes. And what a grim weight. Junior Pac-Man revolves around a big idea. Mazes so large they can't fit onto a single screen, but its expression of that concept doesn't quite work. The mazes span 3 screens horizontally in the arcade, but you only receive 2 extra Energizer pellets over the original Pac-Man's 4 in order to balance out the action. That's 150% the power-ups to cover 300% of the screen space. Now, I'm just a dope who writes about video games that are older than half my audience, but even I'm smart enough to know that this means you only have about half the power-up protection of the original Pac-Man in which to survive Junior Pac-Man's mazes. And unlike in the older game, you can't rely on warp tunnels between sides of the maze to allow you to duck to safety when you find yourself cornered. This makes Junior Pac-Man wildly difficult compared to other Pac-Man games. You need those energizers in order to turn the tables, whether you snag one in desperation or as part of a clever lure to devour your foes. And here you have to make them stretch twice as far. And to make matters worse, each maze contains weird fake-out energizers. They're big, but they don't power you up. Instead, they slow you down. It's kind of douchey. But I do somehow find the 2600 version to be a little more manageable and less stressful than the coin-op game. Maybe it's the fact that Atari's programmers had to rework the mazes in order to work on a horizontal ratio TV screen, as opposed to the vertical format arcade monitor. In arcades, Junior Pac-Man scrolled its mazes laterally. Each level was a single screen tall, but 3 screens wide. The 2600 version literally flips that sideways, making each maze a single screen wide, but 3 screens tall. Each maze had to be rearranged to accommodate this layout, and that has a substantial impact on the moment-to-moment action. I still don't love Junior Pac-Man. Not being able to track the location of monsters at all times when they scroll off the screen makes for a much harder maze chase, even without all of the other disadvantages added into the mix here. But I do find the 2600 adaptation more pleasant than the original arcade machine, which is just discouragingly difficult. It's funny because it makes a terrible first impression. The monochromatic maze and flickering monsters immediately trigger memories of Pac-Man for 2600. But once you start playing, Junior Pac-Man moves faster and more smoothly than Pac-Man did. The graphics don't look amazing, but they're serviceable, and the sound effects are about 40% less grating than Pac-Man's. So in a way, it really does work as an opening salvo for the new 2600 era. Atari may have blown it the first time around, it confesses sheepishly, but this time will be better, probably. And hey, it's not like Pac-Man would be showing up on NES or any other consoles for another few years, right? You want that sweet golden age arcade action in 1986? Atari's still the way to go. If you're nice, we'll even let you plug this card into your new 7800 console. Our second meaningful round in the opening salvo of Atari's 2600 assault on the NES comes in the form of a shot, a hyper shot. Track and Field doesn't stand out in comparison to an older release for the hardware, but rather for what it says about the hardware itself. Now, if you'll think back to an earlier episode of NES Works Gaiden, you'll recall that Konami released the content included in Track and Field for Famicom under the names Hyper Olympic and Hyper Sports. And you'll also recall that the Famicom releases shipped in a special edition pack containing a custom controller called the Hypershot. Well, the same holds true for Track and Field on Atari 2600. This has resulted in one of the rarest and most expensive releases for 2600. The cartridge and controller aren't entirely unseen in retro shops and online auctions, but good luck finding the oversized cardboard box that held them intact in this day and age. The Track and Field controller for Atari 2600 actually looks quite different than the Hypershot. The Famicom controller came as a linked pair for head-to-head play, and each unit contained 2 buttons, one to run and one to jump. You could play Hypersports with the standard built-in Famicom controller, but the tiny face buttons on that system's D-pads didn't really suit the rapid press mechanics of Track and Field. Also, some people still owned the original square button version of the Famicom, and the buttons on those systems had an unfortunate tendency to jam due to their soft rubber construction. The Atari 2600 controller arrived as a single unit, and its face housed 3 buttons, 2 to run and 1 to jump. You may recall that the Atari 2600 controller featured a single button. In other words, Konami looked at the standard Famicom controller and said, "We need to simplify this." Atari saw the 2600 controller and said, "This is too simple." And so a controller with 3 times the buttons of a standard CX40 joystick. Or so it seems. But you can actually play Track and Field without the special controller. It turns out the jump button maps to the CX40's button, while the 2 run buttons are linked to the left and right controller inputs. You run in Track and Field, technically speaking, by rapidly pressing right and left, rather than hammering a single button. But trying to waggle the CX40 stick left and right fast enough to build up your action meter would be both uncomfortable and most likely damaging to the joystick. So here's a controller that simply turns left and right into dedicated buttons. Not bad. The layout might actually make this the best way to play track and field at home on an 8-bit system, since you can more easily alternate rapid presses on 2 buttons with opposite hands than hammer a single button as in the NES port of track and field. In terms of content, well, expect no surprises here. Track and field for Atari 2600 lacks the interface refinement and breadth of content of the NES port that would arrive a year later, but it still contains more events than the 2 standalone Famicom carts Konami released in Japan. You need to qualify in a linear succession of events in order to work your way through the Olympics. You can choose single or 2-player competition at 3 different levels of difficulty, but you always have to play through the events in the same sequence. You play through the 100-meter dash, long jump, javelin, 110-meter hurdles, hammer throw, and finally, the high jump. Your goal is simply to qualify, though of course in competitive play you also want to outperform your opponent. Honestly, track and field looks a lot nicer on 2600 than you might expect. The 70s porn star charisma of the arcade and Famicom sprites obviously vanishes into stick figure abstraction here, but those stick figures and the stadiums they occupy are more detailed and colorful than you might think possible on this system. The NES version would arrive in 1987 and become the most iconic, not to mention comprehensive take on track and field, but don't discount this adaptation. It's well crafted, looks great for the hardware, timely, and packed with a fun extra controller. Man, it's too bad that Pac-Man never officially shipped for 2600. I bet this controller would have been great. Next up on the zombie edition of the Atari 2600 comes a conversion of a computer video game pinball classic. It's Midnight Magic. Apparently, David has disavowed this version. There's some significance to the new name on this cartridge. It contains a completely different table layout than David's Midnight Magic for 8-bit computers, and eventually for XE Game System. However, it does a great job of recreating the precise physics and breakneck speed of its computer sibling. So you can look at this as a sequel of sorts, or a second table expansion pack. Midnight Magic represents a huge step upward for pinball simulations on 2600, which previously consisted of the primitive and barely pinball-like video pinball. Midnight Magic presents players with a more traditional symmetrical layout than the Black Knight-inspired intricacy of David's Midnight Magic, but I don't see that as a strike against the game. The programmers of this version expanded the layout along the horizontal axis to make full use of the available pixel resolution rather than presenting a lengthwise table with a score sidebar. The original David's Midnight Magic layout would have made for an unpleasantly crowded table on 2600. The system lacks the resolution to even render the ball as anything besides a tiny square block with this expanded width, so I can safely say that they chose wisely. The action maps cleanly to the controller. Press the joystick left or right to activate the corresponding set of flippers, or just press down to activate all flippers in tandem. The table contains a number of targets and bonus elements to aim for in both the upper and lower sections, with multiple ball channels running the length of the table's gutter to give you a fighting chance to rescue the ball if it manages to slip that far down. It's pinball on a video game system, and if it lacks the personality and variation of Nintendo's pinball for NES, and the games that would follow in its wake, it still presents a damn good take on the traditional coin-op pastime. And for fans of the original computer game, it's a worthwhile, albeit simple, extension of that work. Not bad. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, the 2600's revival brings 1986 to a genuinely impressive close, but it also brings with it disaster.